He tried to get her admitted to the hospital, but it was filled with wounded from the fighting. I explained the situation to Oberst Klostermann, who was in charge of my group at the General Staff College. For me to leave Lilo while she was ill and in need of unavailable hospitalization, with a 1-year-old child to care for in addition to moving all our belongings back to Leipzig, would have been extremely cruel. Oberst Klostermann agreed and called Berlin to ask them to assign one of my classmates to Norway in my place. They selected a bachelor, Hauptmann Weiser, to go to Norway, which allowed me to spend several additional days with Lilo. Her condition began to improve immediately, and I prepared the dissolution of our household. On January 26th, I put all our belongings into boxes and suitcases and sent them to Leipzig by train. The official termination of our training at the General Staff College was on Friday, January 26, 1945, in the form of a short farewell roll call. Our training was terminated early because the Russians were only 95 kilometers away, and we were needed at the front. The General Staff College was supposed to be moved farther west, away from the Russian threat, and continued there. In fact, it was never organized again, even though the new class was arriving as we left. On Saturday, January 27th, a group of us received orders to report to Army Group Center, commanded by General Feldmarschall Schörner, who was in need of General Staff officers. So I was to fight the Russians again, for the 4th time in as many years. Oberst Klostermann denied my request for a 3-day furlough to take Lilo and Klaus to Leipzig. His only concession was to send a medical corpsman along to help Lilo on the train trip back to Leipzig. Klostermann was a compassionate man, but he was a responsible officer and he felt that I should not leave now. On Monday, January 29th, I took Lilo and Klaus to the railroad station to board a special train for military dependents. The weather was very cold, 5 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was snowing. The station was crowded with refugees from the east who were fleeing the Russians. Fortunately, the train was ready to be boarded when we arrived, and we did not have to wait. Lilo's compartment was too small for her and Klaus and all the luggage, so I fastened the baby carriage to the ceiling of the compartment. We wanted her to take as many of our belongings as possible, because anything that was left would be lost, and she had to make a life for herself and the children after the war, whether I survived it or not. We could not just drop everything and say it was of no use because we were losing the war. We had to go on, just as if there would be a future for us. The train was very crowded. Hundreds of civilians were trying to get out of Hirschberg before the Russians arrived. They knew that advance Russian troops had already interrupted the railroad line once, and that they could do it again. Trains were the only mode of transportation because the government had banned the personal use of automobiles. This one was a special military train. The civilians had been warned to leave earlier, and they should have gone. Military police tried to keep civilians away from the train, but they were not entirely successful. Then it was goodbye. I was sure I would never see Lilo or Klaus again. We had separated many times before, but never before with such likelihood that we would never meet again. I had no illusions. The end was very near, and the odds of my survival were extremely poor. Then the train started to move, and the parting could be delayed no longer. A last squeeze of her hand, a few silent tears, and then I was alone in the milling crowd of civilians on the platform. I returned to our empty apartment at the General Staff College, which now contained only the field luggage I would take back to the front with me. I was overwhelmed by the most lonesome feeling I have ever experienced in my life. After I put Lilo and Klaus on the train, I went to the officers' mess, as much to try to break the spell of loneliness as anything else, but I could not taste the food. I tried to join a conversation about the possibility of the Western Allies helping us keep the Russians out of Germany, but I could not really work up any interest, perhaps because I no longer believed it would happen. I could think of nothing to do to pass the time. I finally went to bed early and tried to go to sleep, but I spent an endless lonely night thinking of the train Lilo and Klaus were on, and hoping it would get through without being intercepted by the Russians. The uncertainty of not knowing and of being helpless to do anything was difficult to endure. Even if Lilo and Klaus reached Leipzig safely, they still had to survive the endless air raids. I put that out of my mind. I could not allow myself to worry about things that might happen. Things had gone well for us until now, and I had to just hope our luck would not run out. The next morning, the General Staff College held a short graduation ceremony in the Assembly Hall. Some bottles of champagne were distributed from the college canteen supplies. Under normal circumstances, graduation would have been cause for celebration, and those of us who had been assigned to Schörner's staff headed for the train station. Although we had 2 hours to wait on the station platform in 5-degree Fahrenheit weather, it was still not as bad as it had been when I saw Lilo off. We opened the first bottles of champagne from the college canteen, which helped to shorten the wait. We toasted each other and tried to be light-hearted and cheerful, but the snow and the cold kept reminding me of that first winter in Russia in 1941. It was a brief train trip to Schörner's headquarters at Waldenburg, since the front was not far away. We arrived in the early evening and checked into the Hotel Waldenburger Hof. This had been the most depressing day of my life. I knew I had to shake off this depression if I was to function effectively. After breakfast the next morning, an officer from Schörner's staff came and interviewed each of us. Then we took a walk through town until lunch. In the afternoon, we reported to Schörner's Chief of Staff, General Zeilander, as we had been instructed to do. Zeilander selected 6 of us for Schörner's personal disposal and dispatched the others to the various armies of Schörner's army group by courier vehicles. The remaining 6 of us were instructed to report back that afternoon to meet General Feldmarschall Schörner. After lunch, I got permission from General Zeilander to call Lilo in Leipzig. She had arrived safely after a terrible 24 hours on the train, with frightened civilians trying to force their way on at every stop. Being able to talk to her helped me dispel some of the gloom from my mind. We reported to General Feldmarschall Schörner at 3 p.m. on January 30th, 1945. Schörner was a capable and successful commander, but it was common knowledge that he had been promoted rapidly because he was a political general and a yes-man to Hitler. He was a rarity, a high-ranking German officer who was also a Nazi. He was known as being both articulate and loud. Most Nazis tended to be uncouth. He shook hands and exchanged a little small talk with each of us. Then a severe scowl clouded his face as he took a position in front of us. "I have just returned from Breslau," he virtually growled. "It is a military pigsty. It is so bad that I considered having the commanding general of the Fortress Corps staff court-martialed. The Russians are practically there, and the city cannot hope to defend itself in its present state. I need 2 energetic young general staff officers with extensive combat experience to go there and help get the city in shape to defend itself." He paused and seemed to glare at us. "I need an operations officer and a quartermaster for the Army Corps Area 8 General Command in Breslau. You all have a lot of combat experience," which apparently explained why the 6 of us had been singled out. "So I will send the oldest and the youngest of you to Breslau. You are to fly there immediately." He turned and disappeared abruptly through a doorway. After he was gone, General Zeilander determined that a major was the oldest and I was the youngest. Schörner had his personal Kübelwagen and 2 Fieseler Storch airplanes waiting to take the 2 of us to Breslau. The Fieseler Storch was a small open-cockpit airplane, large enough only for a pilot and 1 other person. It could take off and land on a very short runway, or even a meadow. We were driven to the airplanes. The major got into one of them, and I got into the other, and we took off. We flew low over the picturesque snow-covered landscape of Silesia, one airplane following the other. We landed at Gandau Airport near Breslau at 4 p.m. A short while later, an aide to the commanding general of the Army Corps Area 8 General Command arrived to get us. He was Hauptmann von Wallenberg, a young officer in his middle 20s. I got to know him well during the next weeks. He was from a wealthy noble family that had a large estate just outside of Breslau. We reported to the Chief of Staff in Breslau, General Major von Lossberg. The 39-year-old von Lossberg was a big man, about 6'2" and 200 pounds, with short-cropped brown hair and brown eyes that were bracketed by crow's feet at the outside corners. After a short conversation with the two of us, von Lossberg appointed me as operations officer and the major as quartermaster, a surprise, because operations officer was the more responsible job, and the major was both older and higher ranking. Then we met the commanding general, General Koch-Erpach. He was about 62 years old, portly and grey, with a fleshy face and pale blue eyes. He had no World War II combat experience, although he had seen combat as a young officer during World War I. Fortunately, General Major von Lossberg was both experienced and capable, and he could compensate for Koch-Erpach's weaknesses. The operations officer I was replacing had been killed somewhere east of the city, although the front was still perhaps 85 kilometres away. With mobile combat, we never knew where or when we might run into fast-moving forward Russian troops. He had taken 2 motorcycle riders with him to wherever he was going, which was standard operating procedure, and one of them had survived the incident and returned to report the death of the major and the other motorcycle rider. There was really little here that could be called a front. There was just a lot of movement in a very broad area. Hitler had declared Breslau a fortress city, which meant that it was to be defended to the last man, even if it was surrounded and totally isolated. The Army Corps staff in Breslau was the home unit staff for the area, which meant that it was a peacetime staff, and that was why Schörner had wanted officers with extensive combat experience to get the place ready for siege. The Fortress Corps staff in Breslau was about 70 people. Because Breslau was the capital of Silesia and had been declared a fortress, the responsibility of the Army Corps Area 8 General Command Staff was broader than that of a normal military staff. In addition to purely military matters, it was responsible for the supply of food for the city, for the flow of refugees through the city as they fled from the Russians, and for everything necessary to keep a large city operating. Although the Gauleiter of Lower Silesia, whose name was Hanke, had all responsibility for the city in theory, the military staff in Breslau actually handled everything. We were fortunate because we had a fortress commander equivalent to a division commander, reporting to our staff whom Schörner had also sent to Breslau. General Major von Alphen was a very experienced man who had lost an arm in combat, and his operations officer was also an experienced general staff officer. General Major von Alphen and his operations officer organised the actual fighting units, so we had only to concern ourselves with things that went beyond the immediate defence of Breslau, such as transportation, communications and supplies. I took over the duties of operations officer on January 31st. Most of the Corps staff consisted of people who had never been in combat and did not know what to expect or how to prepare for it. My first job was to form the operations staff I had inherited into one that was capable of functioning in a combat situation. At first, I personally had to write every report, draw every sketch, of defence lines, troop positions, boundaries between units, headquarters positions, locations of supply depots and so forth, make every entry in a map, make every telephone call, and write every order to our units for the general's signature. I found it impossible to sleep more than 2 hours without interruption, or more than 4 to 5 hours in any 24-hour period. I was assigned an aide, Hauptmann Kaftürke, to help me with my duties. He had been assigned to the staff at Breslau after being seriously wounded at the front. He had good knowledge of the staff and the situation at Breslau, which I found very useful. He was capable, and I learned that I could rely on him. Schörner had been right. The place was a military mess. All the staff people were handicapped or old, and they had no idea how to fight or how to defend a big city. Defence lines had to be designated, ditches had to be dug, preparations of all kinds had to be made. Wounded coming in from the front had to be accommodated. A factory for making heavy water for atomic experiments had been abandoned east of Breslau, and we had to plan and conduct a counterattack to destroy it and keep its secrets from falling into the hands of the Russians. We were constantly occupied with issuing instructions to civil defence units, decreasing staff personnel, issuing ammunition and supplies, providing weapons, enforcing Schörner's order that no man able to fight was to leave Breslau, keeping refugees supplied and moving, finding engines for hospital trains, keeping utilities operating, preventing looting, preparing landing strips in the city in preparation for the siege, all in addition to normal staff functions like the daily military report to Schörner. The hospitals were overflowing with wounded who had to be evacuated, and we had to get trains for them and ambulances to move them from the hospitals to the trains. We evacuated the civilian population as long as possible. Probably more than half of the city's population left the city. In addition to the military, we also supplied the refugees, who needed fuel, food, hay for their horses, and just about everything else. All the refugees coming from the east had to pass through Breslau, whether they were coming from the northeast, east, or southeast. We had to try to help them, to feed them and their horses and cows, which they often brought along, to provide them with the necessities, and to keep them moving. They were practically ill on foot, with horse-drawn vehicles and whatever they could carry with them. Thousands of women, children, and old men came through Breslau every day. The area they were going into west of Breslau was hilly, which would be difficult for them, and it was winter and very cold. It was a terrible feeling to see them come through and know there was very little hope for them wherever they went. Even though they were leaving everything behind, they did not want to fall into the hands of the Russians. They had all heard too much propaganda, and many had experienced too much firsthand. I quickly went from civilian telephone service to a combat telephone network, which both simplified telephone communication and made it more secure. Slowly, with time, everything began to function better. I worked closely with General Major von Lossberg and had an excellent relationship with him. A general staff officer with a good combat record, he was ready for the command of a division. He was a combat soldier at heart, and he wanted to return to the front as a division commander. He thought the government was stupid not to end the war on any terms, because the only possible result of continuing to fight was the destruction of Germany. He loved to escape from present realities, when the situation allowed sufficient time, by playing bridge or scat. Von Lossberg looked after overall strategy and left the details to me. He spoke very openly to me about the hopelessness of the military situation. In spite of everything, however, he thought we had to hold out in the east simply to keep the Russians out of Germany as long as possible. We had just a short time to get Breslau ready for combat before it would be surrounded by the Russians. Days went by. I could hardly leave my desk and telephone. Our only relaxation was the occasional game of cards. On February 8th, a classmate of mine at the General Staff College, Hauptmann Dagel, arrived as an observer from the Supreme Command of the 17th Army. Disguised as an intelligence officer, he was actually a spy for Schörner, a favourite trick of Schörner's. But Dagel was sensible, and I could really use him for productive work. He was likeable and unassuming, a very capable officer with a good service record and combat experience. One chore that Koch-Erpach and von Lossberg thought to be of utmost importance was a report to the Army Command that would prove that Fortress Breslau could not be defended with the present ammunition supplies for more than a few weeks after Russian encirclement. Also, the number of men who were in fighting trim would not be sufficient for a sustained defence. The purpose of this report was to obtain permission to evacuate Breslau in the event that it was in danger of being encircled. Of course, it was in vain, and our orders were to the contrary. The bridges were to be kept open for a possible German offensive across the Oder River. Somebody was living in a dream world. Only in case of extreme danger could the bridges be blown up. The only positive result of the report was a slight increase in weapons, ammunition, and perhaps also our departure by air out of the fortress later on. Together with General Major von Alphen and his staff, we got things into shape so that Schörner was finally satisfied. On about February 10th, the Russian offensive across the Oder River began south of Breslau near Grotkow, and in the northwest near Steinau. In front of the fortress itself, fairly insignificant combat activity continued at first, but our 609th Division soon became involved in heavy fighting and was pushed back almost to the southern suburbs of Breslau. On February 11th, the 7th Infantry Division, which had successfully completed the operation to retake and destroy the heavy water plant at Diehernfurth across the Oder River, sent their vehicles and baggage train into Breslau and pushed south through an enemy that was advancing toward Breslau from the west to form a new front in the area south of Kant. On February 12th, 2 Soviet forces closed the ring around Breslau at Domslau. With that, Breslau had become a fortress under siege. Communication to the Army Command was possible now only by radio or via an underground long-distance cable, which was not safe from wiretapping by the enemy. For important communications, therefore, we used only teletype messages from operations officer to operations officer. The Russian Air Force became more and more active. At noon one day, the first bomb burst in the centre of the courtyard of our headquarters, blowing all my windows inward. I had some cardboard put up for protection, but from then on my staff and I had to wear our overcoats constantly. I ordered the signals officer to prepare a contingency command post in the basement, because it was apparent that it would soon be too dangerous on the ground floor. In fact, I had to dive several times during the afternoon when bombs fell in the immediate neighbourhood. We prepared an offensive out of Breslau to be coordinated with an attack by the 24th Panzer Corps from the south, to open the road and the railroad near Domslau so we could get an ambulance train of wounded soldiers out of Breslau. The offensive was to begin on February 13th. On the evening of February 12th, I had to go to the 609th Division, whose headquarters was at a mansion south of the city. This was the first opportunity I'd had to get some real impression of the city of Breslau. Cattle and sheep wandered in the main thoroughfares, and refugees with carts and horse-drawn vehicles were camping everywhere. The military police were having trouble keeping the streets open for military traffic. I was stopped and asked for identification by civil defence men at every barricade in spite of the Army Corps flag on my car. After getting through all these difficulties, my driver and motorcycle escort and I finally had the city behind us and the front ahead. It was relatively calm, with only occasionally a few rounds of artillery shells or some machine gun fire. Without lights, we proceeded very carefully. Any error in reading the map could have meant that I would suffer the fate of my predecessor. Finally, we reached the headquarters of the 609th Division. I gave the division staff the overall situation, and they filled me in on their situation. I then gave them the orders for the attack and departed with best wishes for the operation. The 609th would either break through tomorrow and escape the fortress, or be thrown back in heavy fighting to its initial position. But the general who commanded the division and his staff were optimistic, and each of the men would do everything possible to get through, because they had all heard too much about the heroically fighting fortresses at Königsberg, Elbing, Thorn, Posen, Graudenz, and so on. They did not want to become the heroic defenders of Breslau, if they could help it. On my way back, I met columns of vehicles in all the streets. Vehicles of the armed forces and of civilians mingled in long columns. The 7th Infantry Division had received the order to get ready and stand by to leave the fortress after the road had been opened. The civilians learned this, and now everybody wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to get out. Even without enemy fire, it would take more than 36 hours to get these columns through on one road. If the columns were burdened with horse-drawn vehicles, it would be impossible. Within a very short time, everything would be blocked. Because of this, I made sure after my return that all military police posts got a strict order to remove horse-drawn vehicles from the columns. After reporting to the Chief of Staff, reading the messages that had arrived while I had been gone, and making the necessary telephone calls, I finally could get some sleep. At 5 a.m., it started getting busy again. The offensive had started, and the first reports of success were coming in. The attack of the 24th Panzer Corps, too, was progressing well. The Russians now bombed even more frequently around our headquarters building. Fortunately, they were small bombs. We moved into the rooms prepared for our staff in the basement. During the morning hours, the offensive had progressed so far that a narrow corridor had been opened up at Breslau. Vehicles were now starting to flow out of the city to the south, but with heavy losses under fierce Russian fire from both flanks. The railroad track, however, was blocked by a heavy tank that had been disabled and stood on the track at Breslau. All efforts to remove it failed, and it was impossible to get the 2 loaded hospital trains out of Breslau because of it. The heavy attacks that were soon launched by the Russians against the tube-like opening stopped the movement of traffic again in the afternoon, and by evening Breslau was a fortress again. Now the brave, and later heroic, resistance would begin. As the Russians got closer, they bombed us more heavily. Then they started shelling us with artillery as well. To defend Breslau, we had 2 combat divisions, plus the Volkssturm and the Hitler Youth. Although the Volkssturm and Hitler Youth were not trained troops, they could help. We could not use such people for offensive operations, but we could defend with them after a fashion, and because most of them were defending their homes, they would fight more fiercely than they might in another place. In Breslau, I got all the reports from the front, and I learned then what was likely to happen when the Russians took a town or a city. When we recaptured a city or town from the Russians, we usually discovered that wanton murder and rape had been the norm while they had been there. German officers were often simply shot, and even enlisted men were sometimes shot just to get them out of the way. The rules of civilized warfare did not exist on the Eastern Front, and the Russians were made even more savage by the exhortations of the Russian journalist Ilya Ehrenberg to exact from the Germans 2 eyes for an eye and a pool of blood for every drop of blood. One great advantage of being on the staff at Breslau was that I could talk to Lilo often. As Corps Operations Officer, I had unlimited access to the telephone. The Russians were probably not interested in cutting our telephone lines, as they were in cutting rail traffic, because they considered it a potential source of information. After I had been in Breslau about 2 weeks, Schörner decided that he needed a corps staff at the current front, which was now about 85 kilometers west of Breslau. Our purpose in being at Breslau had been fulfilled, and General Major von Alphen and his staff were charged with conducting the defence of Breslau, so our corps staff was ordered to leave Breslau and replace a corps staff that had been lost or decimated at the front. In the evening, von Lossberg, Kafurka and I celebrated the termination of our fortress existence with champagne and a game of skat. General Koch-Erpach apparently celebrated his departure from the fortress alone in his apartment, since we did not see him at all during the evening. The next morning, February 14th, we drove to General von Alphen's underground bunker. The city was an eerie sight. Streetcars were running in streets that were empty of people. Bursts of artillery fire exploded here and there. Herds of cattle lowed as heavy artillery shells from big railroad guns exploded every 5 minutes or so. At von Alphen's headquarters, I exchanged telegrams with Army headquarters and learned that we were to fly out of Breslau that evening in 2 Ju-52s and immediately take over an Army corps at the front. Von Lossberg delegated to me the unpleasant duty of selecting those of our staff who would fly out with us and those who would stay. Each airplane could carry only about 25 people. Those who stayed, of course, would be either killed or captured by the Russians. In most cases it was obvious who would be most needed, but there was always a way to rationalize and say, "We need him." It was not easy to sentence people to stay and be killed or captured, and I agonized over some of the choices. Some people came to me with all kinds of reasons why they should come along at all costs. The only one who actually volunteered to stay was the political officer in charge of Nazi indoctrination. He was a Hauptmann, about 35 years old, and he asked me to leave him in the fortress because his job was to be where the situation was most difficult. I had not planned to take him anyway, but I thanked him for his attitude. Those others who had to stay accepted their sentences gracefully. I drove to Gandau Airport at about 7 p.m. Hauptmann Dagel, the spy planted by Schörner, succeeded in getting 4 pairs of epaulettes for the rank of major in the general staff, as well as red cloth for our trousers, since our promotions were imminent. In the officers' mess at the airport, we waited in vain for the airplanes. The airport landing strip already had considerably more bomb and shell craters than it had had when I had landed here 2 weeks earlier, and we could hear infantry fighting to the west. After waiting in vain for the airplanes until midnight, I stretched out on a bench. Early the next morning, someone woke me and offered me a room in one of the airport barracks. There I stretched out on a real bed and fell into a deep sleep, in spite of the shell bursts nearby, after 2 weeks with so little sleep. The airplanes could land only during the evening hours, so I had at least until 7 p.m. In the afternoon, the airport commander offered us a good meal and something to drink. Finally, the announcement came through that the 2 planes were on their way to Breslau. The first Ju-52 landed at 7:15 p.m., and the second one followed shortly thereafter. The airport landing lights were switched on the absolute minimum necessary, and as soon as the airplanes touched down, enemy artillery opened up on the landing strip. The field was large, however, and the shelling did not come very close. The pilots were understandably in a hurry. The ammunition they had brought in was quickly unloaded, and our staff was loaded aboard. General Koch-Erpach's orderly began to load a number of boxes and suitcases, but when he tried to put cases of chocolate aboard, the pilots objected angrily. Fortunately, Koch-Erpach was not there, so I allowed each member of our staff to take as much chocolate as he wanted. Then we were ready. The engines roared, the landing lights went on, we raced down the runway, and our airplane lifted off the ground. The pilot immediately put the airplane into a sharp turn and then tried to gain altitude while staying within a tight circle above Breslau to avoid Russian flak. We had a spectacular view of a large city surrounded by a pearl-like string of burning villages. The front was easy to identify by the flashes from firing guns. Von Wallenberg was even able to recognize his village and his mansion all in flames. Finally, we were high enough to be safe from the light flak, and we turned southwest over enemy territory. The heavy flak guns now began to fire at us as we passed over them. We could see their flashes on the ground as they fired, and then the resulting red shell bursts nearby in the sky. Soon we could see the dark hills of the Zobten, a small mountain range to the south, and then we saw the landing lights at the airport. We touched down at Schweidnitz at about 8 p.m., with the second plane close behind us. We had made it. The tension, which I had hardly been aware of during the excitement of the flight, began to drain from me. I also felt an enormous sense of relief at being out of a city under siege. At the airport at Schweidnitz, we reported our successful escape from Breslau to our army command. Then we made ourselves comfortable and started playing scat again to pass the time, until von Lossberg could get the personnel department of the army in Berlin on the telephone. He wanted to find out about his next position and about the promotions for Dargel and me, which were due that day. At about 10:12 p.m., the call finally came for von Lossberg. When he hung up, he congratulated Daigle and me on our promotion to major in the general staff. We located a bottle of Martell at the airport and duly celebrated the event. My competence in the card game diminished considerably after that. Finally, after midnight, we fell into our beds in the Schweidnitzer Hof Hotel, but not before Dargel and I had given orders to our orderlies to have the new epaulets on our jackets by the next morning. The next day I had a lot of work to do to finish the war diary of Army Corps Area 8 General Command, which had to be submitted to our Army Command. At about 11 o'clock that night we drove to Salzbrunn, where the army had reserved a nice guest house for us, on roads that were crowded with refugees. Many of them had tired cows with them, which they were having to abandon. Fortunately for them, the weather was not as cold as it had been. It occurred to me as I watched them that I had seen the same scenes in Belgium and France and Russia, and that what was happening to Germany now was really no different from what we had done to those countries earlier. It had all seemed so detached then, when it was happening to others, but now that it was happening to my own people, it seemed very personal. Daigle, meanwhile, had sent our trousers to a tailor to have the red general staff stripes sewn on the sides of the legs. The tailor, who had never done such work before, demanded a pattern, and Koch Erpach was kind enough to lend us a pair of his pants for that purpose. The next morning, when my orderly returned from the tailor, we learned that the tailor had managed to do only one pair of pants during the night, and they belonged to me. Poor Dargel had to go another day without them, while I strutted about with the red stripes of a General Staff officer for the first time. General Koch Erpach and General Major von Lossberg reported to General Feldmarschall Schörner and were invited to dinner. Later in the evening we got together again, for von Lossberg's favourite activity, if he could not play bridge, was scat. I went to bed early. I had to store up sleep in advance for what might be in store for us when we took over a corps at the front. Here there was only one telephone in the house, and it was not near my bed. The next morning, February 17th, von Lossberg talked on the telephone with Schörner's Chief of Staff, General Zeelander. Instead of taking over a corps at the front, Koch Erpach and his personal staff were to take over the Army Corps Area General Command at Zwittau in the Sudetenland. Koch Erpach, almost in tears because he wanted a combat command instead of a home unit command, took his farewell of us and drove off with his aide, von Wallenberg, in Koch Erpach's white BMW sports car. Von Lossberg, Dargel and I were transferred to the officer reserve of the army, which at least meant a brief visit home, if not an actual furlough. Happy about that, we began another scat game. Later in the day, a telephone call came in ordering us to recall Koch Erpach and take over a front sector on both sides of Oppeln, with the 168th Infantry and 20th SS Estonian divisions. Dargel was to report to our army group. I called Zwittau so Koch Erpach would get the news immediately upon arrival. Then von Lossberg and I took off by car for Oppeln. Koch Erpach arrived at Erlenburg about midnight. He had driven all day to take over his combat corps, the assignment he wanted so badly. He need not have hurried, however, since it would be a few days before we would take over. We arrived on February 18th, but did not take over until February 23rd. General Seeler was supposed to refurbish his battered division, but the supply of men and equipment had been delayed. Thus we were able to get a little more rest. We were supposed to rebuild a complete corps staff by replacing the people we had not been able to take out of Breslau with us. We also had to get vehicles to make us mobile for field combat, because we had not been able to take any equipment out of Breslau. The front was quiet for the moment, while the Russians regrouped for their next offensive. Our section of the front was near Neisse. During this lull, I spent 1 or 2 hours each day with the current corps operations officer. I also drove around to get to know the area and the division commanders and operations officers. On February 23rd, we took over command of the corps, and I was chained to the telephone again. We now received the equipment and reinforcements we needed. Even without major action at the front, the days went by quickly. Regroupings, new formations, small combat missions, and visits by our army commander provided plenty of work and variety. The commanding general of our neighbouring corps, the 8th Corps, was General Hartmann, the ice-grey one, who as an Oberst had commanded my home-base 24th Artillery Regiment at Altenburg-Plauen and Jena before the war. I spent a pleasant evening at his headquarters after going there for liaison purposes. I also visited the neighbouring corps on our right in order to get acquainted. Otherwise, except for short walks, I could hardly get away from my desk. On March 10th, we were reassigned. Instead of being the leftmost corps of the 1st Panzer Army, we became the rightmost corps of the 17th Army. Our name was also changed from Fortress Corps Breslau to Corps Group Silesia for a short time, and then to 56th Panzer Corps. I drove to Neisse with General Koch Erpach to meet our new army commander, General Schulze, and to discuss the expected Russian offensive at Grotkow. As a result of this meeting, we regrouped and formed a stronger reserve. We also began construction of a defensive position southwest of the Tillowitz forest. For this work, as well as for occupying the position, we had only civil defence units. The local Nazi Party official delayed the evacuation of the civilian population, which we demanded again and again. Since General Major von Lossberg was too high-ranking to be the Chief of Staff of a corps, he was finally replaced on March 14th by Oberstleutnant I.G. von Duffing, who brought a Major Wolf with him as personnel officer. We celebrated von Lossberg's departure with one last card game, my last of the war. Oberstleutnant I.G. Theodor von Duffing was full of energy, hard-working and conscientious, and he had the political finesse a good chief of staff needed. He had most recently been assigned to the training department of the Supreme Command of the Army. Major Wolf, in his late 20s, was an infantry combat officer who had been relegated to staff work because of arthritis. We became good friends, probably because we had so much in common rank, age, and extensive combat experience. The Russian offensive began on March 15th with the usual artillery and aircraft bombardment. The main attack was at the Neisse River, where the Russian superiority in numbers, artillery and air support was overwhelming. In our corps sector, only the outermost left flank was immediately threatened, in the sector of an Estonian regiment. The first breaches of our line occurred during the afternoon, and the village of Münchberg changed hands several times. Other parts of our corps' front remained quiet, except for some reconnaissance activity. The main push was at the rightmost division of General Hartmann's 8th Corps, west of the Neisse River. The Russians reinforced in that sector, and soon they had pushed back our entire front there, and our left flank lost contact with the 8th Corps. The Russians also increased the pressure on our right flank, while everything remained fairly quiet at our front at the Oder River. A Luftwaffe fighter wing abandoned the airport at Lansdorf, and Koch-Erpach tried unsuccessfully to have the concentration camp at Lansdorf evacuated. The Russians pushed the 90th Corps back almost to Neisse on March 17th, and a Russian tank unit crossed the river and proceeded toward Zeitz. The Russian tanks, separated from our corps headquarters only 1.5 kilometers or so of wooded area, drove behind us to Zeitz, where they united with another Russian tank unit that had broken through from the south. With that, on March 17, 1945, we were surrounded. It was not a strong line behind us, however, and the Russian tanks were in a difficult situation themselves because they had German forces in front of and in back of them as well. I was glad von Duffing was there, because he had the diplomatic skill we needed to get orders that would allow us to retreat. Without his skill, we would have been ordered to stand and fight to the last man, which would not have made much sense. If we had stayed, we would have lost both divisions and gained nothing. Even if the Russians had simply bypassed us, we would have been occupying a useless forest that had no roads, bridges, or anything else of value. We would have been just sitting there, and after a week or so we would have been without food or ammunition. The proper decision was to retreat and break through the Russian tanks at our rear, but army units could never get permission to do that because of Hitler's edict that the German army did not retreat. Von Duffing said we had to man a defence line that just happened to be behind us, and it worked. We relocated our corps headquarters in a forester's house in the Tillowitz forest and prepared a plan to break out of our encirclement. I took a motorcycle that had tank-type treads instead of a rear tyre and went to the headquarters of the 20th SS Division, with which we no longer had wire communication and whose situation was completely unknown to us. Arriving without enemy contact, I exchanged situations with the division commander, General Lieutenant Augsburger, and submitted the orders we had prepared for the breakout. Again, without interference from the enemy, I arrived back at our headquarters, where I learned that the 2 leftmost divisions of our neighbouring corps to the right had been put under our command for this operation, because they were surrounded with us. By staying put during the day and moving only at night, we hoped to get through the Russian lines behind us undetected. We did not know how strong the Russians behind us were, but we knew it was a tank force, and we knew that tanks could not fight well at night. We prepared and issued the necessary orders to our divisions, and at dawn I again mounted the tracked motorcycle, with the usual motorcycle escort, to find out how our movements from the Oder River front positions were progressing. I learned that everything was going according to plan. Then I visited the headquarters of the 2 divisions that had been transferred to our command for the breakout. They were under attack and very glad to receive the orders to pull out that I had brought them. We discussed the necessary details for the operation planned for the coming night. Then I returned to Corps headquarters, having to stop to take cover a few times because low-flying Russian fighter planes were firing into refugee columns on the roads. At 11:10 p.m., I drove to Erlenberg to alert the commander of an assault battalion quartered there that he was to provide protection for the Corps staff. I discussed the exact details of the operation with him and pointed out that Koch Erpach was not to be addressed as Herr General during the operation, lest the Russians overhear it. At 12:30 a.m. we assembled. The 20th SS Division was to move to the right of the 168th Division, and the 2 newly acquired divisions were to follow us. We moved along a narrow strip no more than a quarter of a mile wide, on a route that was chosen to avoid any large communities. Our goal for the first night was to reach the woods near Riegersdorf by morning. Our plan was to reach Altenwald by the second morning, and then to turn around and establish a new front. The 2 new divisions were then to break through to the south and reunite with their original corps. It was drizzling rain when we moved out in the darkness at 1 a.m. on March 19th. We marched in single file, using our maps and compasses and bypassing all villages. The Russian outposts remained very quiet. We let a passing Russian vehicle go by unmolested, and it never detected us. A horse-mounted Russian dispatch rider saw us and disappeared at a fast gallop. After a while I took the lead and guided the group, because too often in Russia I had seen infantry soldiers make mistakes reading maps. The wet ground absorbed the sound of our marching to a great extent. Those of us in the front of the column had to more or less feel our way in the darkness. Once I heard a loud moaning and panting sound in the darkness in front of me. With my pistol cocked, I carefully moved forward by myself, ahead of the column. When I saw something moving in a ditch, I called out in a low voice, but heard only continued moaning. Finally, I saw that it was a horse that had apparently fallen into the ditch in the darkness and probably broken a leg. I could not even relieve him of his pain with a coup de grace, lest the Russians in the vicinity be made aware of our presence. Then I almost fell into a deep trench that had been dug by someone as a field position. Fortunately, it was not occupied by the Russians. Sounds of combat suddenly broke out to the right of us. We learned later that the 20th SS Division had run into fierce resistance, and one of the first dead was General-Lieutenant Augsburger, the division commander. It began to get light about 5 a.m., but we still had to move another 500 metres to reach our destination, unfortunately across a deep and rather wide stream. Miraculously, we reached our objective without being detected by the Russians. We posted sentries and sent a patrol to Riegersdorf to find out what the situation was there. I went to the edge of the woods to have a look and try to see what was going on. Now and then I could see Russian soldiers on foot and an occasional Russian rider on horseback. It was obvious that we would be detected if we left the woods. Soon our patrol returned and reported that Riegersdorf had been occupied by Russian tanks. At about 8 a.m., a battery of heavy 105 mm self-propelled guns from the 168th Division joined use, and we changed our plans. One infantry battalion, together with the self-propelled guns, would attack Riegersdorf immediately, because the Russian tanks would be less efficient fighting within the village. Koch Erpach and von Dufing remained at the edge of the woods to observe the battle. I took my aide, Hauptmann Kafurka, and accompanied the infantry battalion commander with the Point Infantry Company. One of our self-propelled guns destroyed a Russian tank at the entrance to the village, and the other Russian tanks, which were dispersed all over the village, disappeared toward the west. A second Russian tank was hit and slid into a ditch half on its side, and its crew got out and ran. We proceeded to the centre of the village, where we were stopped at a church. The Russian tanks had not left the area, but had taken position on a hill south of the village, at a safe distance, from where they now opened fire on our part of the village. Unfortunately, our battery of self-propelled artillery had rushed at full speed on through the village and gone on to break through to the German lines, and we no longer had their protection. The Russian tanks were consequently shelling every house now, causing a lot of casualties. When we spotted a company of Russian infantry approaching from the north, I ordered the commander of our assault battalion to secure and hold the part of the village we had gained. Some of his men panicked, however, and started to run away directly toward the Russian tanks. I pulled my pistol and fired several shots into the air. This stopped some, but not all of them, so I shouted at them that the east edge of the village was occupied by the Russians, which might not have been true, but it got the attention of those who had not stopped when I fired my pistol. Now everybody settled down and dug in, and we held the village until evening. I returned and reported to Kocher-Pach, who decided to wait until nightfall and once more try to sneak through in the dark. To our left, in the area of the 168th Infantry Division, we could hear the sounds of heavy combat, but we were not able to establish radio contact. Our little piece of the woods was circled several times by a Russian tank, but we left it alone because to fire at it would have given our hiding place away and would probably have drawn a whole pack of tanks down on us. I remembered the Russians who had tried to break out of encirclement through my battery during the invasion of Russia in 1941, and I realized now how they must have felt. At about 7 p.m., a unit of 8 or 10 Russian tanks attacked from the south and tried to enter the village. After 2 of them were hit by Panzerfausts and started burning, the others turned around and disappeared. Finally, at 8 p.m., it was dark enough, and we moved out through a depression north of the village. I again led the column. By 11 p.m., we were approaching Altenwald. In theory, we had made it, but we could not be sure that the Russians had not reached Altenwald ahead of us. In 3 days, much could have changed, so I stopped the column and sent a patrol on bicycles to the village, which was still several kilometres ahead. I sent word back to Kocher-Pach that we would be delayed until the patrol returned. Then I sat down under a tree to rest and wait. When the patrol returned, it reported that our own troops were in control of Altenwalde. When I attempted to stand, I was unable to do so. I don't know whether it was the cold or the tension of the last few days, but I was unable to move my arms and legs. Some of the men put me on a bicycle and pushed me along. After about 15 minutes, life began to return to my limbs, and by the time we arrived at the village, everything was normal again, so we had escaped encirclement, although some of our units were still missing. We had got out with most of our men, but we'd had to destroy all of our heavy equipment because we could not use roads for fear of encountering Russian tanks. On March 20th, we established our headquarters in the house of the local sheriff, who happened to have a lot of good things in his pantry. In the morning, I took a car and started looking for our missing units, as did a number of other officers. Major Wolfe and the other half of our corps staff were missing, and the entire 168th Division was missing. Only a few stragglers had reported from the 168th Division. From their reports, I could guess that the whole division had been pushed toward the south, so I drove on through the mountains toward the southeast. I knew there was no continuous front between the Russians and me, and therefore I could run into Russians anywhere, but I had to find the 168th Division. Finally, after a long search, I found some men and officers of the division. After a lot of asking for directions, I finally found division headquarters in a village. When I entered the headquarters of the 168th Division, General Major Schmidt-Hammer looked at me with a bewildered expression. "You are alive!" he exclaimed. "You are supposed to be dead!" The news had circulated through the 168th Division that the Corps Operations Officer had been killed by a direct hit in a fight with tanks. I learned that the 168th had got through with 80% of its men, 70% of its off-road vehicles and arms, and even 20% of its other vehicles. This was, to me, a much better outcome than if the entire corps had perished in the Tillowitz forest heroically fighting. I felt certain that Schörner would be happy we had been able to save the 4 divisions of infantry, even though we had lost practically all our equipment except small arms. I left orders for the 168th to make contact with what remained of the 20th SS Division by means of reconnaissance screens, searching a large area with many small patrols. Then I returned to Corps headquarters. In the meantime, Major Wolf had arrived with the rest of our staff. Their experience had been similar to ours. I learned that the 20th SS Division was in our intended front-line position, but in a weakened state after suffering heavy casualties. Their combat capability had been further weakened by the death of Generalleutnant Augsburger, their popular and respected division commander. We established a new defence line. Then we learned that our divisions had been assigned to another corps, and we, the corps staff, were to be pulled out of the front to be rested and resupplied, since we had lost all our equipment. Preparing a comprehensive combat report and war diary, complete with situation sketches and all the necessary attachments, kept me busy during our period of rest. After a few days, we moved from a school to a mansion, since we were not in charge of any division, and it would not be in violation of Schörner's order that staffs not stay in mansions. Finally, all the reports were finished, and we had only to wait for our new equipment. Since we had no command over any troops, we hardly received one telephone call a day. Our staff had worked together long enough now that it functioned smoothly. Except for my aide, Hauptmann Kafurka, I now had the longest service on the staff. Von Dufing wanted an endless list of things done, standing orders for the staff, alarm regulations, etc. I delegated some of the assignments to aides and insisted on spending part of our rest period trying out the new motor vehicles, going for walks and working 2 horses that had belonged to a former corps commander. The March weather was beautiful, and I intended to enjoy at least some of it, because what lay ahead of us was obviously going to be grim. On March 25th, our idyllic life came to an end with an order to take over a sector of the front in a mountainous area southeast of Ziegenhals. Koch-Erpach and von Dufing departed immediately to make contact. Within 24 hours, however, a counter-order arrived to move instead, by rail, to Lobau for refurbishment. I recalled Koch-Erpach and von Dufing. When they arrived, they decided that they and Major Wolf would go ahead to Lobau as an advance party. Now, as leader of the railroad transport, I had a few completely quiet days of rest without either the commanding general or the chief of staff to make work for me. During the day, I rode the horses, read, slept, and listened to the radio. Finally, my train arrived, and we loaded everything aboard it and rolled north. Exactly 2 months after leaving the General Staff College at Hirschberg, I passed it again as we went through Hirschberg on the train. At about 6 p.m. on March 31st, we arrived at Lobau. I immediately placed a long-distance call to Leipzig and talked to Lilo while the train was being unloaded. Everything was all right at home. 2 divisions were put under our command on April 1st, and we assigned them to build a fallback position about 13 kilometres behind the front. Once, when I visited a division headquarters during this period, I found myself at a Schörner rally. General Feldmarschall Schörner was a rarity, a career officer who was also a dedicated Nazi, although the German army had been deliberately trained to be non-political and we were not even permitted to vote in elections. With political rallies such as this one, he hoped to reinforce the nation's power of resistance. He spoke to soldiers, officers, civilians, and workers at the front and near-front areas. It probably was impressive to many of these people to see a General Feldmarschall with the country's highest war decoration speaking for the Nazi Party. I visited the 57th Panzer Corps, which was in command of the front here. Its personnel seemed to be determined to live as well as possible now that the end was approaching. At least that was the impression I gathered from the number of buttercream cakes and other delicacies they consumed every day. Von Dufing turned down my request to go home for 2 days over Easter, even though there was really nothing to do, although, of course, things could change quickly. On a trip to the headquarters of the Fourth Army, I met my former basic training lieutenant from the 24th Artillery Regiment at Jena, Lieutenant Bad Stubner. He was now a major in the supply service. We had tea and exchanged old memories from 1936. As much as possible, and without telling von Dufing, I followed my aide, Hauptmann Kafurke, who had let his wife come to Lobau. I did not want Lilo to come, both because of her pregnancy and because we were too close to the front and a Russian offensive could begin any time. Slowly our staff, especially the Corps Signal Company, got back into shape. We received younger officers, which made us more capable of combat, but half of our telephone equipment and 2/3 of our radio equipment were still missing. Otherwise, we would be ready to take over command of a Corps sector somewhere. The only remnant remaining from the Army Corps Area 8 General Command of Breslau was Koch Erpach, our 62-year-old commanding general. Finally, he left us as well when, just as we were having a festive fish dinner in honour of his birthday, the order arrived for him to take over command of the Army Corps Area General Command at Kassel, a non-combat job. Although we had broken out of encirclement successfully under Koch Erpach's command, Schörner was quite right to decide that he needed a corps commander with much more combat experience than that. Schörner replaced Koch Erpach with General Weidling, a highly experienced front commander who had been awarded the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, obviously a very impressive corps commander. Weidling, however, was not to arrive until April 13th, several days away. Then we received orders that we were to leave Schörner's army group and join Heinrich's. We were to join General Wenck's 12th Army, which did not yet exist. It was just an army command with some corps staffs. It was being formed in the Harz Mountains, about 400 kilometres southwest of Berlin. On April 11th, my orders put me in charge of the railroad transport. I was to load the corps staff, about 300 people altogether, including our communications company, aboard a train and go to the Harz Mountains. We were supposed to meet General Weidling there. Von Dufing went by car with an advance party, planning to stop and see his family at Wittenberg on the way. I called home from the train station and gave Lilo some hope that I might be able to drop in the next morning for a very brief visit. I thought I might be able to leave the train at Eilenburg and drive to Leipzig on a light motorcycle, and then catch the train again in Halle, Magdeburg or Oschersleben, or even drive all the way to Blankenburg if necessary. The last preparations for loading onto the train were soon completed, and I finally had a chance to have a look at Lobau. Together with several officers of our staff, I went to a restaurant to wait for our departure. The restaurant was completely void of patrons. Schörner had issued orders that anyone caught behind the lines without orders was to be put in front of a tribunal and hanged if found guilty of desertion. We had heard horror stories of innocent people being hanged by these kangaroo courts simply because they were acting under oral orders instead of written orders. Because of Schörner's orders, no soldier or officer dared to be seen in the cities behind the front, even when on duty. I was safe only because of the red general staff stripes on my trousers. Schörner's order seemed extreme to me at the time, but I later realized how important his iron hand was in maintaining discipline under the prevailing circumstances. Finally, in late evening, I climbed into my car, which was secured on a railroad flat car, and the train moved off slowly into the night.